Welcome to the Bar Exam Toolbox Podcast. Today we are chatting with Ariel Salzer and discussing our top 5 essay writing tips. Your Bar Exam Toolbox hosts are Allison Monahan and Lee Burgess. That's me. We're here to demystify the bar exam experience so you can study effectively, stay sane, and hopefully pass and move on with your life. We're the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, the Bar Exam Toolbox, and the career-related website Career Dicta. Allison also runs the Girls Guide to Law School. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review on iTunes and check out our sister podcast, the Law School Toolbox Podcast. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can reach us via the contact form on barexamtoolbox.com, and we'd love to hear from you. And with that, let's get started. Welcome back. Today we're discussing our top bar exam writing tips with special guest Ariel Salzer. Ariel is one of our most experienced bar exam tutors, so we're super excited to have her here today to talk about the essay portion of the bar exam, which, as many of you may know, can be a huge headache for those studying for the bar. So to get things kicked off, Ariel, why do you think the essay portion of the bar exam is so challenging for folks?
You know, that's a really good question, Lee. I think it's kind of a lot of different factors all mashing together at once. So it's sort of this perfect storm idea of the convergence between needing to know a lot of rules, first off, needing to use a lot of facts really precisely, and also needing to finish everything on time. So I think that's a big part of it, all three of those components.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting about the bar process and when it comes to the essays is people get very obsessed with the law. I think they think that the law is really the gatekeeper. If they master all of the law, if you're doing your bar prep now, I'm sure you're listening to hours of lectures on the law, that it feels like if you just master all of the law, if you can memorize everything in your Convisor mini review of 500 pages, that there's no way you can't pass those essays. Do you think that that's right?
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely accurate. And, you know, I mean, we've seen it before. We've seen people who come to us after failing this exam and they say, I knew all the law. I did so well on my MBEs. And you can tell because their MBE scores are really high. They definitely knew the law, but it's not coming into the essays in the way that it needs to. And I think, you know, that's where a lot of people find trouble is that knowing the law just can't help you write good analysis. That's a whole other skill set.
Right, and it's that analysis that pretty much every jurisdiction is going to focus on to give you the majority of your points. And I think students forget that part. Actually, if you've never read the instructions in the instruction manual, I guess it's not the instruction manual, it's like the instructions on the top of the booklet for the test, for any test, whether it's the UBE, MEE, California Bar, I would do that because you might be surprised that those instructions usually talk about analysis a lot more than they talk about knowing the law.
Yeah, it's true. And, you know, maybe don't take your time during the real exam doing it. Do it right now.
That's a good tip.
Because they never really change. You know, they're not going to surprise you with brand new instructions. But it is something really useful to get the hang of because, I mean, you're absolutely right. The analysis is key, and that's where most of the points are.
Another thing that I think just makes this portion of the bar exam hard is, gosh, it just creates a lot of stress and anxiety for people. You know, the stakes are so high, and especially if you struggled with writing in law school at all, this could really be an anxiety point for you. Have you seen that cause struggles with students you've worked with?
Yeah, definitely. And, you know, the exam in and of itself is stress-inducing, but the fact that it's so different from law school finals in a lot of ways can also be anxiety-provoking. So, you know, in law school, we get really, really long fact patterns. They might be a couple pages, single spaced. There might be irrelevant facts thrown in there, like red herrings. On the bar exam, you're not going to see that. It's going to be a really short, as you know, obviously, a really short fact pattern, right? A really short fact pattern. And there's really nothing extra. You have to use everything you're given, which can be really scary because if you see something and you're kind of like, I don't know why they're telling me it's 8:00 p.m., you know, you need to figure out why that's in there.
Yeah.
And that can be stressful.
Yeah. I'll just warn our listeners right now that Ariel and I can totally geek out on this stuff and talk about it for a really long time. So
we'll try to keep the time to a reasonable
exactly.
increment.
We might like talking about the bar exam more than pretty much anyone else I know, really. So,
you know, it's true, but I guess that's why we do what we do.
I guess that is why we do what we do. All right. Well, so now that we know why this part of the exam is hard, and we are really just talking about the essay questions, so fact patterns that you're writing responses to, we're actually going to do a podcast coming up on the performance test, which is a bit of a different beast. So stay tuned for that. But, you know, these tips are really about essay exams only. And if you're still in law school and you're listening to this, some of these tips are also going to help you on your law school exams. So don't feel like there's nothing here for you as well. All right, so let's break it down into ways that the students should be preparing for these essays. Although the different jurisdictions have slightly different exams, the main one being the Uniform Bar Exam has the MEE portion, which there are 30-minute questions. The California Bar is 60-minute questions. But basically, this advice is going to be pretty universal. So, Ariel, what do you think is our first top advice tip for studying for the essay portion of the bar exam?
I hate to say it because we say it so often here, but practice. It really is the only way to get to where you're going with these essays. And it's kind of like the sports analogy we always come back to. It's like trying to learn how to swim or play tennis or something by just watching another person or watching a video or reading a book about it. It's just not going to happen.
No, you've got to do the hard work. Students seem to know this. Like when you talk to them, it's like an abstract idea that they're all signed up for. But why do students either refuse to do it or put it off?
That's a good question. Probably because it's horrible. It feels awful. And I mean, we've all been there. We know how much these essays can take out of you and how frustrating they can be when you don't remember the law and you're not good at analysis at first and you need to work on getting better. The first ones are always really hard for most people, I would say. And the vast majority of people, their very first essay when they practice to take the bar exam, or when they're studying to take the bar exam, I should say, is pretty terrible, actually. Mm-hmm. I know mine was awful.
Oh yeah.
So it's hard. It's definitely tough.
It is really hard. And I think it triggers that anxiety too, right? Then you're looking at this page going, there's no way I'm going to ever pass this exam. And then you walk away from it because you don't want to have that feeling again. And unfortunately, it is that studying through those uncomfortable feelings that one is where the magic happens with the studying, I think, but it also is good to practice that because in the exam room, you might also get a question that triggers that sort of a feeling and you don't have the option to walk away in the exam room.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what you just said brings up two really good points. So the first one is, doing what makes you feel uncomfortable while you're studying. I think that's so important. And we've actually written blog posts about this before, so maybe we can link to them or something.
We will. Yeah, we'll link to them in the show notes.
Yeah, really, really working on the things that scare you the most. Those are probably the things you're the worst at that you need to get better at. So that's the first thing. And then the second one, that moment in the exam where you feel like, oh gosh, I'm having flashbacks of my terrible first essay. I'm not going to do well. This is all going terribly. Just gear up for that moment because it's going to happen at some point. Everybody has a bad moment during this test.
Oh, yeah.
And so I think the more that you can prepare yourself mentally and emotionally and whatever to have that moment during the exam, the more it can feel like, oh, here's that moment that I practiced for. The more comfortable it will feel.
Yeah, mine was question number 2 on my exam. I read the question and my mental response was, huh. That was it. That's
not a good response.
No, that's like all I had to say. And I really realized that I probably wasn't going to pass the California bar if my response was, huh. I don't even think I would have gotten a 45 for those of you taking the California bar. I don't think they give you even a 45 for a huh. So you have to go back and move past that feeling and, start digging to pull something out. I mean, if you can pull yourself together and work through those feelings, there is going to be something in there that you can write about. You're not going to not know anything if you've prepared for this exam at all, but you have to just keep your wits about you enough to keep working at it.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I had a similar moment on my bar where I couldn't for the life of me figure out whether this was a property question or contracts. And those two subjects are not very related. They don't overlap a lot. And so I had to just kind of sit there and think, okay, well, it couldn't be, a full crossover of everything in property and everything in contracts. So why don't I just start narrowing it down one by one, ask myself, is this about parole evidence? No. Yeah. Go little by little. Calm down. Yep.
It's very, very true. And having an attack plan, which is basically what Ariel's talking about, for what to do when you don't know what you're doing is also one of the things that practice teaches you. You have to learn how to work through these questions that are head scratchers. And that's can be the difference between passing and failing, is to not just, give up on those questions, is to still work them enough that you can get as many points as possible. And the way that I think during your study period that you can really make the most of this practice and work on, working through these questions is by, evaluating your work. And I think this is something that students often forget to do. If we're working with a bar review provider that's like a commercial bar review program, sometimes you can submit your essays for feedback and you might get feedback back, and that's great. But I think the magic happens when it's really about self-evaluating your work. And trying to figure out what your gaps and weaknesses really are. Ariel, do you see that to be a big shift for students when they can really start to decide if they're writing passing essays?
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's also one of the hardest things to do. So, doing the writing practice, cranking out the essays like we talked about, that's uncomfortable enough on its own. But then actually looking at those essays, especially if they're really terrible, is really difficult as well. So, but I think you're absolutely right. I think that is where the magic really happens with learning. And if you're not seeing what you're doing wrong and then figuring out how to fix it in the meantime before you start another essay and just try again, it's just not going to pan out as well. Your progress isn't going to go as fast.
Mm-hmm. So there are a lot of different ways that you can do this evaluation. You might have kind of a list of self-evaluation questions that you use to kind of gauge how your work is doing. You definitely want to use sample answers or model answers or whatever your jurisdiction provides you. Make sure you're knowledgeable about what those samples or models are. In the California, they release real student answers that were very, very high scoring. So those can also be anxiety inducing for people because they think that they have to produce that answer, and that's just not the case. Also, sometimes those answers are imperfect because they're written under timed conditions. So you really have to be critical with that. The National Conference of Bar Examiners releases these very lengthy model answers that they're not real essay answers. And so you also have to be able to pull out what you actually needed to have versus what they just added in as explanation. So the self-evaluation process can be kind of challenging. And if you are struggling with that, you should definitely reach out to, all the resources available for you at your school, with your bar review provider, with tutors, whoever it is that you're working with, to make sure you know how to evaluate your own work.
I couldn't agree more. I think that's so important.
Yeah. Now, once you evaluate, though, does the fun stop there? I don't think so. Because if only, because then oftentimes you have to rewrite the work. And students feel like once they have done an essay once, they should just toss it to the side and never look at it again. But do you think that is the right way to handle that?
Well, to throw me a softball question.
Oh, yes, here you go.
Absolutely not the right way. I was writing a blog post the other day for the Bar Exam Toolbox, and I was thinking, how can I analogize this to some kind of situation? And so I was thinking about a Rubik's Cube, like the little boxes with all the colors that you try to mix around and make into a, whatever box with the colors on the right sides.
Right.
I don't know how to describe a Rubik's Cube, but, basically, so if you start with one that's all scrambled up, just bear with me with the analogy, and you decide I'm going to do this in 5 minutes, and you set the clock and you scramble around for 5 minutes, and then you stop the clock and start it over again and scramble around for another 5 minutes. If you keep doing that, like you do with the essays, with no review in between, and you're not looking up, like, how do I solve a Rubik's Cube? What are my rules that are wrong? Whatever it is that you're supposed to be learning from each pass that you take at it, you're never going to get any better. I don't know if that makes sense to anyone but me.
No, I think it does make sense. And I think looking at these questions as a teaching tool is really powerful. I think that so often we think, well, the questions are just the questions, but we can use the questions to learn the test. They can only be so creative. They can only write on so many issues. There's only so much law they can test. If you really start nerding out on the questions like we do, you will start to see patterns. And you can do that as you study. But if you do lots of practice on an individual subject, it's pretty amazing where you're like, wow, they seem to raise these 2 or 3 topics together frequently because they fit together, or things like that. And so by really rewriting and getting comfortable with what facts trigger that law, like why wasn't my analysis robust enough? How could I argue these facts? You might see similar facts in a question on the exam and go, aha, I'm so glad I did that question twice because now I really know how to make it more robust.
Exactly. And I think I was just thinking back to a student that we had last bar season that you and I both worked with who studied for, I think 10 days, was it? Right before the exam. And, that was a big part of what this person did is they looked at, how does parole evidence show up in a fact pattern? What does that look like? I might not remember the rule exactly, but maybe I can remember what that fact situation kind of feels like so I can recognize it again, which is so valuable. I mean, it really is.
Yeah. And so really studying just the test itself and not just the law is so critical. And the practice is really where you do that. Okay. So hopefully by now we've convinced everyone they need to practice. And by the way, by practice, we mean you should be writing every day.
And even though the person I mentioned passed the exam, study for more than 10 days.
Oh, yes. We wouldn't recommend the 10-day study plan, but it was a special situation. They were not taking the multiple choice portion of the bar, which definitely removes pressure. And someone was a very experienced test taker, and we just took a shot at it. but we did. It was amazing that he did pass. But it is not our recommended study plan for the bar exam for sure. A blog post is coming though on how you can study for a couple weeks if you only have a couple weeks. It's in my list of things to write. Okay, so after practicing though, what about studying the law? We think it's really important to study the law in a way that's going to make essay exams easier. What do you think? What do we mean by this, Ariel? I'm going to send you another softball.
Yeah, sure. So a way to study the law that makes the exam easier. Well, I think the first step is make it as simple as possible. Cut it down into short sentences. If you're studying rules and you don't totally remember what dependent relative revocation and wills and trusts actually means, like what is that? Look up the topic, make sure you understand it, and then boil it down into a small piece with buzzwords or rule elements that you can kind of latch onto and remember, and then remember those rule elements first. You can flesh it out later, but I think getting rule elements and kind of putting those into the attack plan idea that we talked about before, and this is something you can use in law school as well. Like if you boil the rule down into a simple set of checklist items, I think it's going to be a lot easier to remember and apply.
Yeah, you don't really have time to write these really long and verbose rule statements that maybe you had time to do on your exams in law school. And I think for students who are taking, are used to taking, especially open book exams in law school, which are becoming more and more popular, you might feel really comfortable like having paragraph long rule statements because you were copying them out of an outline or a pre-written essay or something like that. You can't do that on the bar. There's no time, and you can't memorize all that information that way unless you have a photographic memory. And if you do, good for you. But most of us can't do that. So we really have to simplify, and make sure that we turn this law into digestible, chunks. You might struggle with that if you're taking a full commercial bar course because there's so much material, but that is one of your jobs, is to distill it down into an amount of law that you can actually commit to memory. Of course, there are some tools that you can use. We like lean sheets. We'll also link to some reviews that we've done of lean sheets at the end of this podcast recording. But, they kind of take the opposite approach. Their outlines are so lean that you really get the bare minimum kind of that you might need to know for given rules. And then maybe as you're studying, you might need to expand on them a little bit. But it's about short, concise rule statements. I don't think people fail generally the bar exam because they had too short or direct rule statements. You maybe didn't know the rules, but if you knew them and you wrote short and concise rule statements, I don't think that's what's going to prevent you from passing.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. And even if you do have some kind of eidetic memory, where you can just look at your convisor mini review and remember the whole thing, don't write long rule statements anyway. They don't want to see that.
And you don't have time. You don't have time.
Yeah, you just don't.
You just don't. So what about other, we have seen all sorts of memorization techniques come through our law student and bar exam programs. But, we like people to really think about what's worked for them for the past, but also to think outside the box. We've gotten into some visual learning techniques. We actually did a guest post with the guy who's working at Sketchy Law, which are some visual learning videos for unpacking some of the with some of the MBE topics. But what else have you seen works for students when they're just trying to memorize such a large amount of information?
Yeah, good question. Aside from breaking it down, I would say the weirder the better. I'm a huge fan of weird mnemonics or songs, or, I've heard of people like making up some kind of almost like a marching rhythm kind of poem or something, and then kind of walking around as they say it. And for some reason that helps them internalize it. It's more kinesthetic or something like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I made a mnemonic for all the hearsay exceptions and used like superscripted, again, to nerd out, use superscripted numbers. Like R3 means that there's 3 things that start with an R. And I wish I could share it, but it was so full of profanity and, again, weird, that I really can't just put it out there on the air. But, go do something like that, because that is something I will never forget.
That is brilliant. Yeah, I think what you're saying, though, is important, that part of this is about learning the law to make it your own, so it has meaning to you. So whether or not that you're able to use someone else's mnemonics or make your own, or use someone else's visuals or make your own, I think it's just important that you really figure out what you need and do it yourself. I was talking to another student who was working with us for the bar, and he was saying that he'd made an agreement with his wife that he was going to be able to teach her all of the law for the bar, because he learned by teaching and talking things through. And so she just agreed that at night he could like talk to her about all the bar studying he'd done during the day. And that was really how he was going to be able to commit things to memory.
I love that idea. And there probably won't be a lot of people sitting around like, teach me what you learned all day long. That takes a really special person in your life.
That's true.
But, I've worked with students before who taught their dog all the law, or they taught the poster on their wall all the law. And it sounds crazy. They, taught a stuffed animal the law. But, saying it out loud in a way that, like we always say, a smart 10-year-old or your grandmother or somebody would understand even without a legal background. I think that's so powerful in making sure you actually understand it.
Yeah, exactly. All right. So moving on to our next tip. We think it's important that you become an expert at reading and analyzing facts. We've already talked about how important analysis is a little bit. Because really the more and more we learn about this test and what the graders are looking for, sorry, guys, they're looking for legal analysis. That's what they really care about.
Yeah, definitely.
So students become obsessed with the amount of law that they need to know, which we've already kind of said. But the majority of these points come from the legal analysis. And so one of the things you really have to think about when you're thinking about legal analysis is not all issues are created equally. Within the question, they are going to trigger major issues and minor issues. And your job is going to be to not only identify all of those issues, but identify which issues are really ripe for legal analysis. If it's something that's easy and slam dunk, if you spend a gigantic paragraph on it, you're only going to get a small amount of points, because there are only a small amount of points available. But if you skip over facts that created ambiguity that you could have really argued both sides about, and you just ignored it, you're not going to pass the question.
Yeah, definitely. And, I think we talk about this with students a lot. Like, how do you tell, looking at a fact pattern or outlining your essay on scratch paper, how do you tell what those big issues are? So I think one of the things that we always tell students is the more facts, the more points. If you see a lot of facts about something, or you see some weird ambiguity like you were talking about, and it raises, oh, this could trigger that particular rule element. Maybe they're telling me it's 8 p.m. because I need to know about the common law versus modern rule for burglary, which involved being at night when somebody broke into something.
Right.
So things like that. Like, where are the facts telling me to put my attention?
Exactly. Continue with the burglary example. There's a great California bar question that has a guy entering through a partially cracked door of a garage that's being used for a home office. And so that, again, it's like you're reading these facts and you're like, that's weird. So they chose specifically to have the door be, cracked slightly. So then it's like, is that a breaking? Well, it's kind of clear. And then it's like he enters and it's a garage. So is that part of a dwelling? Is it a structure? It was used as an office, not as a home. It seems attached to the home. So you're reading that going like, wow, these are a lot of weird details about this guy entering this home office garage, but they did that to create a lot of robust dialogue. We saw a lot of failing answers to that question that just said, oh, well, sure, he entered the garage at night to steal computers. So, yeah, He's
there
done.
you go, burglary.
There you go,
right.
burglary. That's not a passing answer.
Right. You have to really explore why those facts are in there, exactly like you were saying.
Yeah. All right, so experts at reading the facts. Again, this goes back to why the practice is so important. So we can just say it one more time, that the way you really get comfortable with these facts is by studying the questions, by doing questions over and over again, and by starting to see some of these patterns of how they write these questions. You know, these questions are not written like off the cuff. They're well vetted. They are, they've gone through multiple rounds of editing. They've really sat down and thoughtfully selected almost all the words in the question. So you read it like that. You know, there's not a lot of extra padding in there that may have been in some of your law school exam questions.
Absolutely. And, we actually, that exercise we do with students using the computer and the garage hypo, I mean, I was hard pressed to find one fact in that fact pattern that didn't make some kind of difference. Mm-hmm. You know, they really are intentional about it with all of these. So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And if you're in law school and you're listening to this, this exercise of really becoming obsessed with reading the facts and carefully reading the facts and putting yourself in the position of the person who is writing the question and choosing those facts can also help your law school exams as well, because your professor has constructed this question to solicit a response. And the bar examiners have constructed these questions to solicit a response. The facts are how they tell you that. And so the more comfortable you can get by thinking, okay, well, if I was writing this fact pattern and I had to choose the word garage over carport or driveway or, whatever it might be, shed, like, there's a reason that they chose garage. And why is that important? It helps you if you can get into that mindset and think about the person who is drafting the question.
And, just one final thing on this, remember that it's always, always, always coming back to a rule element. They're not just giving you facts so you can randomly discuss all kinds of things about garages or whatever. Hopefully you wouldn't do that, but a lot of times people get really carried away, and you always have to bring it back to the rule element. They're telling me garage because it's a structure, because it's a house, maybe. Yeah. Right. So I think that part is really important too.
And that's really where that law and the factual analysis kind of really come together, that ambiguity in those facts are there to trigger legal issues, and your knowledge of the law allows you to do that analysis. And so that's how all those things are connecting to each other. But without some knowledge of the law and some comfort level with the facts, it all doesn't come together in that beautiful IRAC that gets you all the points possible.
Oh, IRAC.
Oh, IRAC. Yes. All right. So what about taking time to practice exams? This is something we definitely talk to all of our students about, that it is important to not just do practice, but take timed individual questions, but also to do them in exam blocks, right? To replicate what you will actually see on exam day, depending on how your jurisdiction sets up your exam.
Yeah, definitely. And, I think a lot of people, what I see most often is people are really gung-ho about doing big blocks of questions at the beginning, maybe because they're not exhausted yet. So at the beginning, meaning, in June for the July bar or in January for the February bar. But, make sure you're not doing these big blocks of questions too early in the process. Make sure that you do have some kind of handle on the law, and you're not just doing the whole Rubik's Cube thing of like throwing 3 questions out there and just scrambling. Mm-hmm. So I think that's an absolutely beneficial strategy to do the blocks of 3-hour questions or whatever your jurisdiction has. But yeah, the timing is important too. When you do those is important.
Yeah. And even, outside of just taking these timed practice exams, you can also study in similar blocks of time that you will be taking the test. So sometimes students like to say, well, if I'm going to have a 3-hour window in the exam room to do work, I better start getting comfortable sitting for 3 hours and focusing, because it does create fatigue. I mean, we're big fans of taking breaks. Breaks are really important, but you also have to work within the confines of what the bar is going to let you do. And if the bar is going to make you sit in one spot and not drink water and not get up for 3 hours, then not only do you need to practice doing essays in those conditions, but you also probably just need to get comfortable with making yourself sit for 3 hours and focus, and not check your phone and not check your email and not get up and take a walk or not get a snack. Snacking is another big thing. People get so used to drinking water and snacking, they can get really distracted when they don't have those things that they can call on in the exam room.
Yeah, definitely. I agree with that. And, that's one of the reasons I always tell students, especially in the weeks leading up to the actual test, like on your desk, you should just have your exam bag with your highlighters. It should be clear plastic. It should have your driver's license in it. Make it exactly like the exam. Don't get up, right. Do 3-hour blocks on a timer. And that way it feels comfortable and you don't feel like you're needing to reach for those security blankets like a snack or, whatever it is for you.
Yeah. Coffee.
That's a big one.
I know. Yeah. So these are all things to think through and to just be conscious of as you're studying, no matter if this is your first time or if you're a repeat taker. How often do you think that people should do these timed practice exams? I mean, do you think like a block a week, a couple blocks throughout the season? Does it depend on what they think they're struggling with?
Yeah, I think it definitely depends on what you're struggling with. If timing is an issue for you and you feel okay on individual essays, but when you slam 3 of them together, all of a sudden your timing goes out the window, then yeah, this is a great thing for you to practice. The one thing I would be concerned about is exhaustion. So right before the exam, while these big blocks are good, you don't want to take a real 3-day bar exam in the 3 days before the bar exam or something crazy like that. You don't want to go in exhausted.
No.
So yeah, I think it can be pretty individualized when these blocks of questions happen, but definitely when you start doing closed book essays, you can maybe factor in a couple of these and just see how they go.
Yeah, that's a good idea. And that's a really good point. I have friends that run marathons and you never run a marathon like the week before you run a marathon. So you don't.
Right.
And the bar is
You're just eating carbs and resting.
Exactly. The bar is kind of like running a marathon. You definitely feel like, I've never run a marathon, but I hear, that you're very exhausted after, I can only imagine. But the bar does feel like a marathon by the time you're done. And so you do want to make sure that you're not driving yourself into the ground before the exam days. All right. Our final tip that I wanted to make sure that we talked through was that you've got to remember how quickly the graders will be reading your answers and really put yourself in the position of a bar exam grader who's going to read very, very quickly. And can you make their job as easy as possible? You should, basically, is what I mean.
That's the right answer.
Yeah. I always say a happy grader gives happy grades. The harder the job, if they have to go start looking for things, if they're confused by your writing, if they can't find if you've raised issues, that's typically not going to do really good things for your scores.
Absolutely. And, one of the things we keep talking about IRAC and how great it is. This isn't because we love IRAC and it's so scholarly and magical and wonderful. It's because it makes it very obvious. Where is your rule? Where is your analysis? Where can I skim to and then give you points? That's what they're looking to do. And if you can separate out your paragraphs and make it clear, like, hey, grader, this is my analysis, read this part.
Right.
Yeah, because, how many minutes are they really spending on this?
In California, it's like 2 minutes, maybe 3. And then that's for an hour-long essay. And so the MEE, it's similar or even less.
And I think it was you, actually, Lee, who said, why don't you try reading one of your essays like you were a grader? Spend 2 minutes on the clock and see if you can give yourself all the points. Can you find everything? Is it in there?
Yeah. I used to do this as an exercise in some of my classes when I taught classes on the bar exam. And we would, you can even read your partners. You can get a group of friends together and all read each other's and see what you can pull out. Because I think a lot of people don't really appreciate that the job of the grader is to really make a snap judgment on whether or not you're qualified to practice law. Now, that can make you really upset and nervous and angry that's how, this big life decision for you is made. But it's just the realities of the exam. So you have to realize that you want to write knowing that they're going to be reading very quickly. So headers, paragraphs, clear and concise writing. No copying and pasting is a big one. See above.
Please don't do that.
Please don't do that because they don't have time to read the same thing over again. Make sure that if it's a multi-part question, make sure you've clearly numbered your answer so they can find all of the parts. I remember reading an answer when I first started tutoring for the bar. It was a evidence question out of California, and it was a 5-part question, and the student had done miserably on it. And I'm reading his past exam answer going, how could this have gone that poorly? Because it's not that bad, until I realized there was no number 4 in his answer. He had numbered 1, 2, 3, and 5. He had talked about number 4, but there was no heading. And I think they gave him no points for his number 4 analysis. And I think that would have passed that question and gone a long way to getting him closer to passing. So it might seem silly to obsess about stuff like that, but it's really not silly.
Well, and one of the things when we were talking about differences between law school exams and the bar, your professor might be giving you the benefit of the doubt. They might say, oh, well, this person probably has a number 4 section in here somewhere. I'll keep reading. Mm-hmm. The bar exam grader is not going to do that.
No. No. And your law professors are likely spending a slightly longer amount of time on, let's hope on your final exams than the bar exam graders who are just cranking through piles of these. It's faceless. They don't know you. It's not like you're their student. They don't have they don't have a huge emotional investment in trying to make sure you succeed. They know they're probably failing a good chunk, depending on your jurisdiction, of people whose exams they are reading. So
definitely.
It's good to just keep that in mind.
Yeah. And, with the bar grading too, one more reason to have a good solid attack plan based on the rule elements with headers that go with the rule elements. You want your essay to look like the other essays in that stack, right? Mm-hmm. You don't want it to stand out and look really weird because otherwise it's not going to fit in well. They're not going to pass it.
Very true. Very, very true. So your goal is to be a good, solid essay, in the pile that doesn't get any special notice. You just want that passing score and moving on.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So true.
And with that, we're out of time. But before we finish up, I want to take a second to remind you to check out our blog at barexamtoolbox.com, which is full of helpful tips to help you prepare and stay sane as you study for the bar exam. You can also find information on our website about our courses, tools, and one-on-one tutoring programs to support you as you study for the UBE or California bar exam. If you enjoyed this episode of the Bar Exam Toolbox Podcast, please take a second to leave a review and rating on iTunes. We'd really appreciate it. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. If you're still in law school, you might also like to check out our popular Law School Toolbox podcast as well. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to Lee or Allison at lee@barexamtoolbox.com or allison@barexamtoolbox.com, or you can always contact us via our website contact form at barexamtoolbox.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk soon.